All right, AP students, we're moving on to number 3 here from 2011. So if you need to pause it and work this problem here, one of the more challenging problems we've had, there's a little bit of a more dynamic to it that we've got to take into account. So pause it, take a shot. Let's see what you come up with. Okay. So they added a little bit of a different dynamic in this case than we've seen in class time. And in this case, they have what they refer to as owner's equity, okay, which can be used to do any number of things in a bank. But what you've got to know is that our required reserves are only based on our deposits. So as a bank, I can loan all this money out, okay, if I wanted to, but my required reserve is going to be based only on people's deposits. The reason that is because the government wants to make sure, the Federal Reserve wants to make sure that the people's deposits are always available to be withdrawn. Okay, so it adds a little bit of a different dynamic. We haven't really seen that yet. This is a little bit of an older test, so that might be why it's on there. I have not seen questions like this as we've been preparing for the last few years, but we'll go over it anyway. It's one more thing that we can figure out. So here's our deposits. Our required reserves are based only on our deposits. That's going to be 20%. Okay. Now, Part B, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is going to, in this case, say that they're going to purchase 5,000 worth of bonds. So they're going to buy the bonds. So now these bonds, this is going to change from 7,000 to 2,000. Now we have some excess reserves in here, okay? Because these bonds now turn into currency. So our excess reserves, okay, so part one, our excess reserves goes up to 5,000. It asks for the new value, okay? Now, for our demand deposits, or how much does it change by? Sorry, make sure I read that close. Now, it also asks what happens to our demand deposits. Well, nothing happens there. Okay, the bank can also use demand deposits to buy bonds or sell bonds, sorry, buy bonds, either or. So our demand deposits don't change. Our change in demand deposits is zero. Always a tricky question when they want you to say zero for something, but they do try to do that to you sometimes. Part C, asking you to find the maximum amount that the money supply can change as a result of the $5,000 purchase of bonds by the Federal Reserve. So I've got 5,000 new dollars I can loan out. My reserve, or I'm sorry, my money multiplier is 1 over the reserve requirement, which is 0.2. So that's going to equal 5. So I've got 5,000 times 5 equals $25,000. Okay. Part D, and again, as long as you have these right numbers here, you're going to figure that out. The reserve requirement is pretty straightforward. The money multiplier is pretty straightforward. All right, when the Federal Reserve purchases bonds, what happens to the price of the bonds in the open market? The price of the bond is based on how much you give up to keep that money in the bank. If interest rates go down, which we know when the Federal Reserve buys bonds, interest rates are going to go down. All right. So interest rates go down, which means that if I'm going to invest my money in the bank and not spend it, I am gaining less money on that interest. I could be doing something else with that money rather than leaving it in the bank, whether it's investing in the stock market, whether it's buying property, whether it's doing whatever I want to do. Okay. You've got to think almost backwards in this case that the price of bonds for you and I are going to increase, and it's based on opportunity cost. The cost of keeping that money in there has gone up because the interest rate has gone down. The value has decreased. Okay, so the opportunity cost increases in that particular case. Tricky, backwards way of thinking. If you can remember that, that would be maybe the difference between, like a 95% and a 100%. All right, suppose that instead of purchasing bonds, another splitting hairs here of they're saying if I deposit money into a checking account, remember a checking account, a debit card for this kind of talk is the same exact thing as cash on hand. It is M1 money supply. So they deposit 5,000 cash into the checking account. What's the immediate effect of the M1 money supply? That is money I can use right away. Okay. M2 money supply is going to be like your savings accounts where I got to move that to my debit account. All right. So there is no change for part E. Super challenging question. Don't get too discouraged. I have not seen problems like that in the last 10 years. And so, um, don't get too discouraged. Put it in your toolbox that you kind of know how to do it now. Hopefully, you got a chance to be able to utilize that if needed. Email me with questions. We will talk soon.